Hi,
Hi, it's good to meet you, sir.
thank you. Who is speaking?
This is Nick D'Onofrio, Tim.
Oh, hi, Nick.
Hi,
Nice to meet
I'm
you.
the co-chair along with the good senator. You
Oh,
got stuck with
right.
you got stuck with me because of case. So
Okay.
yeah, that's how I get here.
I think I've spoken too much already for James, so I will go on mute and take my picture off too.
No, you.
But it was nice meeting you.
Yes, good meeting you, sir.
MJ, how are we doing? How many people do we have in the
Letting in, there's 4 more people coming in. Couple more.
it starts slowing down, let me know, and then we'll get the
Yes, there's no one new right now in. We have 51 people in currently.
okay.
No one in the waiting room.
All right. And are we set with the streaming?
Yes, we are on YouTube Live. I know CTN is in here, so there should be streaming.
Okay, great. All right, Nick, are you ready? We'll okay.
I was born ready, James.
All right, good. I'm glad one of us was. I was born late. Never caught up. All right.
No.
Okay, MJ, can you just make sure everyone is muted? Yeah. Okay, great. All right, good morning, everyone. We are calling this meeting the first meeting of the Connecticut AI Task Force to order. And I would like to start I guess I'll introduce myself. I'm James Maroney. I am one of the 3 co-chairs of this group. I'm the state senator and the co-chair of the General Law Committee. My co-chair on the General Law Committee and another co-chair of this group, Mike D'Agostino, has unfortunately cannot make this meeting today. He has another commitment for his job outside of the legislature that he couldn't miss. But I would like to introduce our other co-chair, Nick D'Onofrio, an IBM executive. Are you retired, or do they ever let you out?
I prefer to think of myself as graduated. Yes, James. I'm gone.
Okay, so Nick, if you would like to just say a few words.
Sure. Thank you, Senator. And it's good to be with you all on this incredibly important and critical topic. So Nick D'Onofrio, I live here in Ridgefield, Connecticut. My wife and I and family have been here since 1987. It's where we will end our life. So we love Ridgefield. We're here protecting the Western Front for all of Connecticut from New York. So we're your first warning system. I am an electrical engineer. I did honest work for a living at one time. Designing chips, circuits, computers, software. But as James alluded to, I got to become an executive vice president of IBM Innovation and Technology, and I graduated from IBM in 2008. So I have been gone since then, although I remain an IBM Fellow Emeritus. Fellow is their highest technical rank, but emeritus. I've spent the rest of my life doing a lot of different things, working for other companies, on boards, for our government. I did a lot of work and continue to do a lot of work, not only for the state of Connecticut, but for the United States. And I'm here, not because it's a random event. I'm here because I am a member of CASE, the Connecticut Academy of Science and Engineering. And they, as James and his partner wrote into the bill. They are in the bill that brought this task force together as a co-chair, and Case chose me. So that's why I'm in front of you. And I am excited to be with you, looking forward to learning right along with you as we kind of take apart this piece of technology so that everybody can do a better job of understanding it, appreciating it, and knowing what its strengths and weaknesses are, its consequences, both intended and unintended. And I can see already on our screen, we've got some of the smartest people in the world here who know 1 ton more than I do about AI. And we're going to do everything we can to get their best ideas and thoughts in front of us all as we deliberate. So James, thank you for having me, and thank you for also having me along with your partner. Thank you.
Yeah, Nick, thank you very much. We're very excited to have you as part of the team and appreciative of everything, the experience and connections that you'll bring to the process. And one of the goals of writing Case in was that I do feel that Case is an underutilized resource by the state legislature. And so we're hoping to involve them more in helping us develop good policy as we go forward.
I couldn't agree, James. I couldn't agree with you more. I've spent a lot of time rebuffing Case, to be honest with you, and rebooting it. So I'm glad some of it got to you. So it makes me feel like, okay, I got something done here. Thank you.
Thank you. And this, for those of you who are on that, we're in former working groups. So this task force was actually part of the legislation. And so this task force is a little more formal than we have been in the past, in that there were appointing authorities for all of the members of the task force. And so the way we're going to conduct the meetings, we're still going to welcome everyone who's been in the past working groups and the lobbyists and other advocates who sat in on the meetings. But when it comes time to question our speakers, it'll only be the members of the task force. And we have both voting and non-voting members of our task force. And so, MJ, is anyone from Senator Blumenthal's office on, or have you?
The senator is here.
Okay. So what we're going to do is, cognizant of the senator's time, Senator Blumenthal's time, we're going to ask the senator to speak now, and then as we have time, as we go through today's meeting, or perhaps in between, when the senator wraps up and the next speaker, we will go through and introduce all of the members of our task force. But again, when we get to questions, it will be the members, both the voting and non-voting members who have been appointed to the task force, just to try to keep this on time. But again, one of the goals is that transparency. So we do want people watching this, and we're streamed by YouTube as well as by CTN. So with that, MJ, is the Senator Blumenthal on. So we're very fortunate to have Senator Blumenthal here today. Senator Blumenthal, along with the Senator Hawley, have released a bipartisan framework for regulating AI. And he is going to come on to talk a little bit about the framework and his next steps. So Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you so much, Senator Maroney. And thank you to members of the task force. I'm really very pleased and excited to join you today to talk about what we're doing at the federal level, which is, in a sense, inspired by what you're doing in Connecticut. Connecticut has taken a very important first step in the legislation that was passed already to give the Office of Policy and Management important responsibilities to assure that artificial intelligence purchased by the state of Connecticut in no way is discriminatory or otherwise creates unintended harms. And that's very much a goal that is one of our, in the United States Senate, as it has been for the Connecticut legislature. I am the chairman of the Subcommittee on Privacy and Tech, which is a subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee, and Josh Hawley is the ranking Republican member. Josh Hawley and I are, perhaps you might think, an unlikely pair to be aligned together, to be cooperating and partnering in this effort, but in fact, we are strongly united on this framework, which provides a couple of really essential principles. Number one, the idea that there has to be a licensing regime, much like we do with drugs or cars or airlines or even toys for children, so that standards are applied and safety and efficacy are assured. Safety and efficacy obviously have to be proved for any drug before it's released to the market. Likewise, we're proposing a licensing regime to be administered by an oversight entity, call it whatever you'd like, a new office, a new agency. But the point is that much like the Office of Artificial Intelligence, which was proposed in the Connecticut legislation, we want to create an office or agency to establish a licensing regime and then enforce the standards and the results of its work. Enforcement is very important, whether it is by this new office or by private lawsuits, possibly by state attorneys general. The combination of federal, private, and state enforcement is a collaboration that I know from my career as an enforcer. I was state attorney general and United States attorney, essential to making this system work. Now, transparency is also an essential principle. People have a right to know and have some notice as to whether they're seeing the results or creation of artificial intelligence. And so having some kind of watermark, as it's been called, or other notice, I described it as a ingredient label, much as we see on food, but some notice, and also transparency about how the algorithms work. There has to be some access so that there is information made available to experts and others about the workings, the nuts and bolts of artificial intelligence. Very important also that there be accountability. When the companies producing these models of artificial intelligence have knowledge that their product is causing certain harms, they should be held accountable. No Section 230 immunity. Everybody on this call knows what Section 230 is, but very few people in America do. If they did, I think they would be outraged that social media, for example, has this complete immunity about what happens on their platforms. And we have stated unequivocally, Section 230 immunity should not be given to artificial intelligence models or the companies that produce them. We are dedicated to keeping this framework bipartisan. It's a milestone because it is bipartisan. It's also comprehensive, highly detailed. You can go through it. It's available. And I urge you also to follow what we're doing in our hearings. We've held a number of hearings already with some of the best known names in this industry: Brad Smith at Microsoft, Sam Altman at OpenAI, experts who are well-known names to people who have knowledge in this area. And of course, Senator Schumer has been having forums. We had 22 of the tech titans come before a closed door forum. Our hearings in the subcommittee are open. People come to testify in public under oath, but the forum that Senator Schumer organized was behind closed doors, very much aligned with what we are doing, even though very distinct and different. And I'm pleased to say that behind closed doors, these tech industry leaders and experts supported the basic provisions and principles of our framework. Very strongly supported the idea there has to be some government regulation. That was really, I think, the major takeaway from the closed door meeting that Senator Schumer had with these 22 leaders, everyone from Mark Zuckerberg to Elon Musk to the heads of Google and Apple and other companies. So we are very optimistic. I shouldn't be over optimistic or at all complacent, because as you know, getting stuff done in Congress is really difficult, even with bipartisan support. We want to make sure that these principles and the framework we've adopted result in legislation, not just a statement on paper, because we want to make sure that the enormous promise of artificial intelligence, and there is enormous promise, is achieved, but the panoply of perils avoided. People are becoming all too familiar with deep fakes, impersonation. And what we face here is the harms like discrimination, election interference, fraud, scams, making sure that the licensing regime avoids these perils as much as possible is one of our objectives here. We're going to encourage states to move forward, because as in Connecticut, they can provide models for us. They can inspire us and motivate my colleagues to do more. When they see in their own states what is happening, we can overcome many of the obstacles that may be placed in our way by the big tech companies. And I'll just finish on that note. There's no disregarding or dismissing the obstacles, not least of them the potential opposition of the big tech companies and others that may try to prevent us from moving forward. And you've seen it a bit, I think, at the state level. We see it even more largely at the federal level, but the principle is the same. The entrenched interests, the special interests may have their own objectives apart from the public interest. And so we are determined to move forward. I've worked with Senator Maroney and others on the task force in consulting with you and getting your ideas. I hope you'll continue to provide your ideas. We want to encourage the startups, the innovators, the inventors. So we don't want to be heavy-handed and create a lot of costs that may exclude the innovators, may create barriers to entry. We want to make sure that there is real access to the market. This licensing regime should not create unnecessary obstacles, but it should protect the public and make sure that the integrity of these models is well known and trusted by the public. Trust and confidence are really essential. Again, the promise of AI is enormous. It's been around for a decade or more, but people are focusing on it now because the newer models are making real now some of what has only been in science fiction. In effect, science fiction is becoming our reality now. These models can impersonate a voice and create content, much as I demonstrated at the very first hearing we had, where I opened by saying, now for some introductory remarks. What followed was my voice taken from my speeches on the floor of the Senate, nothing I said, or created, because the content was created by ChatGPT. And it sounded eerily, creepily, exactly like I did. It was indistinguishable from what I would have said. And I think that created an awareness among my colleagues that the future is now upon us. Science fiction is real now, and we need to be prepared to counter the potential perils while preserving the best and the most promising of potential outcomes. And we're going to continue working through these hearings. We'll be holding more of them, again, public hearings, and I hope that you will give me the benefit of your ideas and your comments, your suggestions, your criticisms of this framework, and that we have a chance to talk very soon. Thank you.
Senator Blumenthal, thank you so much. We appreciate your time. I recognize you're down in DC doing work, so thanks for taking the time out of your day to address us. Do you have time for a few questions or?
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to start with one. You mentioned the public hearings. Someone did ask me, would it be possible, and I can work with someone from your staff, are there summaries of those hearings, or I guess we would just have to go through the links to watch them?
There are transcripts, and we can work with you on providing something that can be circulated to your task force, of course.
That would be great. The other question I have is, as you work on legislation, I know a number of states are working on legislation. Would there be preemption for your legislation, or would that become the floor, right, of potential regulation and allowing states to go further?
My personal view is that states should be encouraged to go further if it protects a vital public interest. But my real hope is that we will be so comprehensive and strong in our legislation that the issue of preemption, in effect, will be avoided.
And
I think there's going to be a strong tendency on the part of my colleagues to want some preemption, because we want to make sure there is a national standard. And that's what I think a lot of the creators and innovators want too, because they don't want to have to meet regulatory standards among 50 different jurisdictions potentially.
Agreed. I think a strong national framework is in everyone's best interest. I'll see if Nick, do you have any questions? Otherwise, if you're a member of the task force and you have a question, if you would just, on the reactions, just click reactions on your Zoom and then raise your hand. We could recognize you.
So James, thank you. And Senator, thank you. As always, it's good to see you and good to hear from you. And this may be a little bit uncomfortable, but Senator, what you're doing, is it going to be applicable to the U.S. defense and intelligence community as well? Or is that a separate and completely, segmented off thought process?
I think the models, insofar as they're available to the public, will have to meet all of these standards. If they are used in a classified or secret setting only, they will not be available to the public, obviously. And so I think that the evaluation would be done through a separate channel. But obviously, if they affect the public, if they include any kind of showing of deep fakes, for example, any kind of impersonation that is made public, they would have to be licensed.
So that's going to be a trust issue that we'll end up having to deal with, Senator, because in the end, that's what's going to be the best foundation for all of the work that you're trying to do and that we're trying to do here. And I'm sure we'll pass back over this topic a few more times, before we conclude. Whether it's defense, intelligence, or law enforcement, we're going to have to build that side of the confidence level up as well.
Well, Nick, artificial intelligence is already used.
I know. I do know that. Yes.
It's widely used. I'm not saying anything that
It's not a secret. I understand, sir. Right.
Because the images that are collected by our surveillance mechanisms are screened and are evaluated through artificial intelligence. And that's an example of how artificial intelligence can evaluate and screen all kinds of non-classified data, ranging from x-rays of your lung, for example, in detecting cancer, to documents collected through litigation, and a lot of other kinds of tasks. But the same principle is at stake. The models that are used by our defense or intelligence agencies, not available to the public, won't necessarily have to pass muster under this licensing regime. and they will be kept secret. But the point is to avoid harm to the
There you
public. They can
Thank you, sir.
kind of model that we're proposing.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. I'd see Mark Raymond.
Good morning, and thanks for allowing me my question, Senator Blumenthal. Great to see you. And thank you for taking the charge on this at the national level. You clearly have your hands full, but are up to the challenge. My question sort of is about making this harder. Technology is a global effort, and global standards would be really important. Are there any conversations about how we begin to account for rationalizing some of these things outside the U.S. jurisdiction, or in your estimation, is that perhaps too big of a challenge for us to undertake at this time?
That is really an excellent and key question, because artificial intelligence is going to be produced worldwide by China and Russia, adversaries, as well as by the UK and France, our allies. And I think the best way to think about artificial intelligence is to compare it to civil aviation. The airplanes that you fly, a lot of them are foreign airlines. Sometimes, Middle Eastern airlines. I've flown on airlines of many different countries, ranging from Germany to UK to all kinds of other airlines, but they all meet standards. Civil aviation, the design and the criteria airlines and their airplanes have to meet are standard worldwide, and they are based on the United States standards. So, for example, the 737 MAX that crashed was an Ethiopian airline produced by Boeing. It had to meet American standards, and so the FAA had to relicense or reapprove the newly designed 737 MAX before any airline in the world would buy it. Our cars have to meet certain safety standards. Our drugs have to meet certain safety standards. Now, in other countries, they may approve drugs before we do, so the system operates a little bit differently, but the principle is the same. I think there have to be some kind of worldwide standards. And my hope is that the United States will set the pace and establish the baseline for AI. But if you compare other areas, and including medicine, genetics, there are grave perils in what can be done in the field of genetics, but so far we've had pretty good cooperation worldwide. And so I think this is a developing area that really is so critical. But if we hang back, if we fail to learn the lesson of social media, where we let the genie out of the bottle, the Pandora's box was open, and now we're trying to catch up, we will lose that position of leadership in the world. We have to be at the forefront of setting these standards. And I'll just say about social media, I've proposed a measure called the Kids Online Safety Act, which is designed to protect children online against a lot of the toxic content, bullying, eating disorders, suicidal ideation, sex abuse, drug abuse, that is driven to them by algorithms, social media algorithms that are very simply designed to make more money for the social media company. This legislation addresses the product design of those algorithms, not the content, not censorship. It's the product design to achieve more transparency, but give parents and kids the tools to take back control, to disconnect from those algorithms. So we know from social media, these algorithms are already out there doing grave harm. And I want to impose accountability there too, separately from this artificial intelligence framework that we have proposed. And other countries are moving forward. The UK has just passed a major social media and artificial intelligence bill. The EU is moving forward. All these countries are moving ahead, and we need to make sure that we are not only keeping up with them, but also leading.
Thank you. I think we have time for just, do you have time for one more question? Actually, I should ask. It's 11:30, so I'm not sure.
Yep.
Okay, so Steve Hernandez, I know your hand is raised, and then we'll move on after Steve to our next speaker. And Senator Blumenthal, thank you so much for your time and for your leadership on this issue.
Thank you, Senator, for your commitment. Steve Hernandez from an agency of the legislature that focuses on equity and opportunity. And thank you for your commitment to really rooting out implicit biases that may be written into the technology, either directly or inadvertently. I think that's really important. Something that I think about as I think about emerging technologies, especially supercomputed large language models and other types of artificial intelligence, is equitable access to that technology by people who may not otherwise have it. What I worry is that that this technology may only be accessible to those with a great deal of resources or with a great deal of movable capital or investable capital. Is there any conversation at your levels about how it is that we can make this technology safely available more equitably to people who may benefit greatly from the innovations that come from this and other types of artificial intelligence?
Another great question. Yes, we are very much attuned to the issue of access, equity in access, so that not only are there no barriers to entry, but also no barriers to access, particularly barriers that are based on income, race, other improper kinds of obstacles. And on the issue of discrimination or hidden bias, we are working very closely with the civil rights community on these issues. They are tremendously important. I've met personally on numerous occasions with representatives of the civil rights community, the LGBTQ plus community. Very, very important to reduce, in fact, eliminate all of the hidden, sometimes hidden biases that may cause inequitable results. And so, for example, Maya Wiley has personally sat with me to talk about these issues. Very, very important. And the impacts here, the harms that can be caused, need to lead to accountability. Again, I've said it before, but let me say again, no Section 230. When there are harms resulting from potential inequities, for example, discrimination in the workplace. If resumes are screened by an AI model that eliminates certain candidates for employment based on discriminatory factors, we need to know and eliminate that kind of discrimination. So the point you've raised is really critical to assuring that we do not have harms that are fully preventable. They are preventable. And frankly, that other countries may not be as sensitive or ready to acknowledge. And I think there too, our leadership is important. And I will just say finally, in making all of these statements as I've done, I want to emphasize I have no claim to knowledge that's any greater than any of you. I am learning as I go. And I think that I will benefit from your views. I've appreciated these questions. I hope that we can get together in person at some point. I want to thank Senator Maroney and others who have led in the state legislature. Connecticut is one of the first to deal with AI, to acknowledge the need for standards, particularly in purchases by our government. We have a bill in the United States Senate, and we had a hearing on it just last week involving government purchasing and the impact on AI. So I think there's a lot to learn from each other. And I'll just finish with on this note, you know, in this closed forum that we had, one of the industry executives, one of the top executives said, and I'm paraphrasing, but it's pretty close, I'm an engineer and I'm the head of this company and I don't know how these algorithms work. I don't know how these algorithms work. So I'm saying to you as Richard Blumenthal, your US Senator, I don't know how these algorithms work. And we need to learn more about it. There are probably some folks on the call who do know, and I hope I can learn from you. Again, my very sincere thanks, James. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to being with you, all of you, again in an in-person setting. And keep up the great work.
Senator Blumenthal, thank you so much. You're always so generous with your time. And again, thank you for your leadership on this important issue.
Thank you.
So we're going to move next to our next speaker. I know we had talked about doing the introductions when we have time, but I've invited all the speakers on the 30 minutes, so we'll get started with Susan Frederick, if she's available. MJ is
here, Senator. I'm here.
okay.
Little box.
There you are. Hi, Susan. How are you?
Hello. I'm very well, thank you. Thanks so much for having me attend and present at your meeting. I'm going to just go ahead and launch into my stuff here. I know you guys are constrained for time, so just a brief introduction of myself. I'm Senior Federal Affairs Counsel for the National Conference of State Legislatures. We are based in Denver, and with our satellite office in Washington, D.C., which is where I work, I staff our Artificial Intelligence, Cybersecurity, and Privacy Task Force, which is now a growing body of state legislators and legislative staff. I think now we're up to like 35 folks. We started at 15 back in 2016. So we've doubled in size and interest. I want to just say, just as a follow-up to Senator Blumenthal's remarks, that, you know, one of the key stakeholders in all of this has got to be our state legislatures across the country, who have already moved ahead in some respects to regulating certain aspects of artificial intelligence. But I digress. I'm here to talk about federal activity on AI. And I'm going to try to share my screen here if I can, so that you guys can see kind of what we're up to, or what they're up to. And I'm gonna, there we go. Whoop. Okay. All right. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with NCSL, just a 30-second brief. We are the bipartisan or nonpartisan organization that represents all 50 states, its territories, and the District of Columbia. And this task force that I mentioned is comprised on a bipartisan basis of legislators and legislative staff from all over the country. Federal activity on artificial intelligence. The first thing I want to talk about is something you probably have already been at least exposed to, which is the administration's Blueprint for AI, which came out in October of 2022. This was put out by the administration's Office of Science and Technology, and it was a combination of staff, and then they brought in some experts from around the country to discuss what an AI framework ought to look like and to provide guidance as the U.S. was looking to move forward on issues related to artificial intelligence. So there are 5 basic principles, which you can see on the slide. Safe and effective systems, which deals with making sure you have the appropriate stakeholders in the room, that you're having appropriate consultation with issue experts in areas related to artificial intelligence. lots and lots of testing. That seems to be a uniform theme across the federal sphere. So even when we talk about congressional legislation, whether that materializes, testing is a very, very integral component of any piece of federal legislation. And I think also we're now seeing that pop up on the state side as well. Risk identification, which is really, the 6,000 foot, the brass ring, I guess, of AI, which is identifying where the vulnerabilities are in the algorithm, where is the bias, and then of course risk mitigation, which is to say, how do we deal with that once we know what it is. So discrimination protections, you heard Senator Blumenthal talk a bit about that. Again, equity assessments, where are these algorithms biased toward one slice of our population as opposed to others? How are we making sure that there are appropriate equitable considerations being made? Ongoing monitoring and mitigation. Again, it comes up all over the place on federal guidance for AI. So data privacy is another area where the administration and this blue ribbon panel of experts felt was an important component of any artificial intelligence algorithm or system before it can be put into place. Respect for individuals and personal privacy. Many states have already, yours is one of them, passed comprehensive privacy legislation. So there is you have recognized that there is a concern around these issues of privacy and only using data for the specific purpose that it was collected for and not disseminating it across the board for other inappropriate uses. Consent is another component that this blue ribbon panel felt was important, that if you're going to collect information from people, they need to know and give their consent for that information to be collected. And then concern for sensitive domains, so areas of healthcare, financial services, workforce, education, areas where you wouldn't necessarily want information to be leaked or disseminated. There's an issue there to be sensitive to those areas as well. And then the next principle, notice and explanation, pretty self-explanatory. If you're using AI for a particular purpose, let the people who are involved in that know that you're doing it. So if you're using an employment screening AI program, for example, let the applicant know that what you're doing is being, dealt with an AI system, and be able to provide a clear and brief explanation of what that AI system or algorithm is designed to do as the user is involved or using it. The last principle is human alternatives. One of the issues that we have heard consistently from our membership on the task force is from their constituents is, does the use of an AI system mean that there is no human interaction, that you're eliminating the human element, which can translate to loss of jobs in state government, loss of personal attention, inability to answer specific questions on a case-by-case basis? And the answer is a resounding no. You need to be able to have that human element present to deal with inconsistencies in the program, and to be able to answer questions and relate to constituents and customers on a personal level as needed. So that's sort of the framework of this artificial intelligence blueprint. And I urge you, it's online, you can pull it down. There's a technical companion that goes with it if you're interested in implementation pointers. I am not a computer scientist, I'm a lawyer, so I can't get into the nuts and bolts of coding and how these things work. To Senator Blumenthal's point, I'm not really clear on how these algorithms play out, function in, function out, and all of that. I went to law school, so I wouldn't have to do any of that stuff, but here I am. So moving on, the other piece that kind of goes along with the AI blueprint is the NIST AI risk management framework, which is a very important piece that I urge you to also take a look at, because it goes hand in hand with the blueprint, but it gets down into more of the weeds of implementation and hopefully answers some of the gnawing questions you may have with respect to how best to put these algorithms to use in a constructive and beneficial way and to mitigate any potential harm that you might find. So again, there's 5 precepts or principles that the NIST framework espouses, framing the risk and prioritizing it. So they have come up with 3 types of harm, as you can see, harm to the people, harm to organizations and government, and harm to the overall ecosystem. So we want to make sure that we're diligently looking at that concept before we deploy an AI system into the greater world. There are challenges with that, recognizing that no system is ever going to be perfect. There's this constant need for testing and monitoring, and you'll see that as another common theme throughout the federal piece here. Trustworthiness is the second one. And, you know, that's probably one of the more difficult concepts for people to get their heads around, because how do we trust a machine? You know, how do we create that ability to trust what we're dealing with in an AI world, so to speak? There has to be a push, I think, to show that the systems are valid, reliable, and safe, that they are transparent and there's accountability baked into that system, so that if something doesn't look right or feel right or come out right, there is that human element that can go back and deal with it. Fair, explainable, and privacy enhanced. Again, they reiterate one of the principles in the AI blueprint, that concern about where's my information going if I submit it, what is going to happen to it. Need to be able to tell people where it's going, what it's going to be used for, in a way that is easily understandable and clear. This framework, as much as they talk about risks and mitigation and all of the downsides to AI, they do want to propose that it's not all negative. There are benefits to using the NIST framework, and if you know their position is, if you follow it, you're probably in as good a place as you're going to be, for now anyway. And they want to help educate users and folks that are actually designing these systems on improved awareness and the relationship of the trade-offs between trustworthy characteristics and things that aren't so trustworthy. So they do want to promote that aspect. They've come up on the management of AI. They hit pretty hard on these 4 concepts of governing, mapping, measuring, and managing. And what those mean exactly are, for governing, you develop, you know, I guess an overarching strategic plan, if you will, for lack of a better way of terming it. You know, what is your strategic plan for deployment of the system going to look like? It doesn't have to be terribly specific, but you need to have one. Mapping is framing out the risks. You know, where, if we deploy this system, what can we foresee? We looked into a crystal ball as potential risks in deployment. Measuring is, of course, looking at the methodologies and assessing what are the benchmarks of the system we want to deploy. What are some of the things that we need to make sure that we are looking at as the system gets into use in the general public, and how do we go back and of course, managing is dealing with incidents where it's not working properly. Again, that human element is critically important. They do want to say zero risk, no such thing as a perfect system. You have to regularly test and update once you deploy. There's no getting around that. That is just part of what this needs to be in order to be successful as it rolls out, and even after it rolls out. So one of the things that has happened most recently, and this was in July, was the administration called in the seven largest AI companies and got voluntary commitments from all of them. And you can see I've put the list up there: Amazon and Google and Meta and Microsoft, OpenAI. They got some voluntary commitments from these companies, recognizing that in the absence of federal legislation, it's really up to these large behemoth companies to take this issue on and work internally to make sure that everything is working as it should, and that there are commitments to things like testing, information sharing on the security side, cybersecurity, always important, promises to report and information share on vulnerabilities. So if Amazon comes up with something that's not working right, they have committed to sharing that with the other large companies as well, so that they can be alerted to potential issues. And then this trust issue, again, another common theme, building the trust. Notice, again, users have to know when AI is being used. And then research is a priority for these companies. We want to make sure that, or the administration wants to make sure that these companies who are so ensconced in our popular use of the internet and that they are looking at ways to perfect their systems as close as they can get, and that there is this safety issue and trust issue abounding there. One of the issues that we've heard from our membership is, when we look to do state legislation, and states are looking to legislate in these next upcoming legislative sessions, how do we define artificial intelligence? It's a complicated subject. It's a complicated concept. We want to make sure we're encompassing, all of the elements of an artificial intelligence algorithm and program. How do we deal with it? So when we met in Rhode Island back in June, we had one of the members from the commission that developed the AI blueprint come in to say, if she were to figure out like what is a good place to start to define it, she would look to the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, or the ADDPA. And I've put their definition up on the slide. It might be a little small, but it's there. And it's a very broad definition, and it looks to encompass, all of the different aspects of what AI is. So she felt like it was a good place to start. Also, there is a California law out there, which I'll mention in a little bit, that also has a very comprehensive definition. They've tried to define it as well, but it's a good place to start. And she really hit on the concept of a covered algorithm. What does that look like? What does that mean? Computational processing techniques was another piece that she felt had to be in there. But you can see how broad this particular definition is. The other recommendation that was made to us was look to your existing statutory provisions, look to the Constitution, look to federal law to see where things like anti-discrimination laws are already in place. And you can use those to incorporate into how you deal with regulating artificial intelligence. And that, I think, is a really important point, because it can be an overwhelming task to think I have to start from square one, and I have to look at all the different things that can happen if AI is not used correctly, and the impact that it will have on people and companies and the general population. So don't reinvent the wheel. Look to what your existing laws already say. So you all in Connecticut have a comprehensive privacy law. What are some of the things that you've pulled into that law that can also be applied to artificial intelligence? There's discrimination laws at the federal level. You probably have state anti-discrimination laws as well. I'm going to make another shameless plug for our task force. We are a really, really dynamic group of folks that have really taken this issue on, head first here, dove right in. One of the points that was also made was look at your, if you're going to regulate, look at the different sectors that AI touches. So healthcare, maybe it's best to, instead of a big bill that maybe overlooks some things or can't, one size doesn't fit all in terms of how it's applied in different sectors, look at healthcare. Maybe you figure out how to deal with that in its own, sort of bubble. Financial services, completely different area. Criminal justice, another one that you may need to tweak and look at differently. So the sector by sector approach was something that was discussed, amongst NCSL legislators. And then another point is that, and this goes to that, is that policy intervention can happen at any point in the AI pipeline. It can happen during the development phase. It can happen during the deployment phase. It can happen during the risk and mitigation and testing pieces. So don't feel constrained by, is the system out? How long has it been there? Let's collect all this data and let it go for a year or two. It can happen anytime. And that was one of the recommendations that was made to our members as well. I want to give another shameless plug for our recent publication, which is our artificial intelligence primer. And I think you'll find some really good information there. You'll find everything that I've just mentioned, at least referenced in that document, but you'll also see what states have done with respect to artificial intelligence legislation through 2022 or 2023, legislative sessions. We will update that state component and federal component as things transpire. You'll see some references to the EU's regulation of artificial intelligence, which could be helpful to you all as you consider what the issues are and how the European Union has decided to regulate in this area. One of the other recommendations, which grew a huge gasp, was move beyond a task force and a working group. You have tools now. You have tools now to already look at issues related to artificial intelligence. You have experts in your state agencies. You have, resources that you can draw on now rather than having a 2-year working group or task force. And of course, legislators love to have task forces and working groups because they really, they want to dig in with a, cautious approach perhaps. But our folks that came in to speak to us in Rhode Island was, come on, you guys, don't just settle for a task force. Do something concrete and, really make your mark. So I'll throw that out there as a recommendation as well. Specificity when creating transparency requirements. Again, another recommendation that we heard from when folks came in to kind of educate our members on artificial intelligence and how to deal with it. Focus on the impact, not the technical details. So you don't need to know coding or how to create an algorithm as a state legislator. You need to know what the impact of that will be on your people, on state government, on the community at large. And then one of the most important points that I mentioned earlier was look at what a consequential decision entails. Look at what that should mean. And here's the language from the California bill, which you can, use as a benchmark or for reference. Actions that have a material effect on the impact of access to, eligibility for, cost in terms of or conditions of certain circumstances. And then I've listed everything that they put in their definition. So they've covered it. Employment, financial services, criminal justice, even voting and government benefits are included in that language. So if you're looking for a place to start, you might want to look there. And then here I am. If you need to reach me, here's my contact information. I am happy to answer any questions and respond to requests for information. We have a very large research staff in our Denver office, and they look at all the state legislation. They provide analysis. I can help with that, putting on my attorney's hat. And then just 2 more shameless plugs, because we do have meetings coming up in the fall and into the winter. Our base camp, which is a virtual meeting, we will be talking about technology issues there and specifically artificial intelligence. And then our bigger meeting in Austin, Texas in December, where we have 1 whole day and a half slotted for technology issues with a hands-on component to it, as well as general speakers. So there you have it. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much. One thing I will point out is you did mention SB 6, our comprehensive data privacy bill. We do have a definition in there. So we do establish the right to opt out of processing for solely automated decisions. And we define decisions to produce legal or similarly significant effects concerning the consumer. It's almost the exact same as the consequential decision definition from AB 331. So decisions made by the controller that result in the provision or denial by the controller of financial or lending services, housing, insurance, education, enrollment or opportunity, criminal justice, employment opportunities, healthcare services, or access to essential goods or services. So I think your point is well taken on definitions, right? That they're critical. And so as we look, we want to make sure we're doing our best to align across states, also internationally, since the EU is really probably going to be the first one with the AI Act. But we also have to be careful to align across different bills within our own state. And so, and your point was well taken, again, using what we already have for some of these things. So with that, I had some other questions, but I see 3 people with their hands raised. I'll let them go first. And if my question's not answered, I may ask later on. So Matt Lenz raised his hand first. So Matt.
Thanks, Senator. And I'll be really brief. It's really more of a comment. I just wanted to thank Susan and NCSL for the work that they're doing on this. I'm very familiar with the working group and all the great work that NCSL is doing. I thought that presentation was great, and I just wanted to acknowledge and kudos to you and everybody over there doing that work.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. We're going to see you next week, I'm assuming, at our convening in DC.
Yes, we'll be presenting and looking forward to it.
That's right.
And David?
I thank you, Susan, for that presentation. I appreciate that. Just one quick question. In the commitments that you mentioned by the big AI players, that to be transparent about how they use AI, are you finding that they are currently undertaking this transparency? Because I feel like I haven't experienced that as a user. And I actually just got an email as you were talking that inviting me to participate in the Meta Advantage Plus machine learning program. And I don't see any indication when I'm going through Facebook that that is a thing that is being used to determine what ads I'm seeing. So what are your thoughts on the current status of these companies being transparent about the use of AI?
That's a really good question. And I have to assume that because their commitments came out at the end of July, I'm just going to assume that things are slow and rolling out. Maybe they're looking at the best way to do that across their platform being so huge. I have not had a conversation with Meta about when they're doing it. I think Meta we're having a meeting next week at the end of the week, and we've got Google and Microsoft and then BSA, the Software Alliance, as Matt mentioned, on kind of not on the hot seat, but they're going to be presenting. And I assume that they will be able to tell us, what their plans are for that rollout. But right now, I don't know. I can't answer that for you. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Susan. David, we do have a presenter from Google, who is one of the 7 companies, and they have put out a document updating where they are with implementing. I'm not sure. So Beth Tsai will be speaking from Google as soon as we finish this up, actually, these questions. And so that may be a good question to ask her if it's not part of her presentation. And then speaking that Google does have a document on that, so I could put that in. And Susan, if you wouldn't mind sending me the primer as well as your slides for today, and I know I've received the primer before, but just so I'm being lazy, so I can have it in one place with your slides, and then we'll disseminate those to the members of the working group. So we'll do our best to get all of the materials that are presented and disseminate them afterwards to the members of the working group. Nick?
Yeah, so thank you very much. Senator Susan, well done, like everyone said, and thank you for putting the material together. Susan, great outline, great format here. 2 simple points. Number 1, I think you're going to have to press harder on the source and apps of where all this work gets done. How does it get done? And how do you know that you're in control of? Now, I'm not talking about me, I'm talking about the company that's providing the service. We've been calling this value chain, we've been calling this supply chain, call it whatever you'd like. We can't give up on that thought. We need to know where every piece of the value is created, and then that should become part of your risk framework. Because if part of that value is created somewhere else, your good intentions can be all wonderful, but you have no idea what's really going on. So value chain rendered explicit every step along the way might be something that NCSL thinks about putting into that framework. Am I clear on what I'm saying there?
Yes, I totally agree with that. I think that is really where, the rubber hits the road for a state legislator. I will say,
Yeah.
if we're going to regulate, how are we going to regulate? And what are the requirements that we feel are reasonable and attainable, to put on a company that's deploying a system of
Right.
this magnitude? And I
Right.
would say, even with the federal legislation, I think it's just a multi-layered process. The feds
Yes.
have to look at where the states are. That's one of our positions. We always say, don't just throw out a piece of legislation at the federal level without understanding where the states are on the same topic, because
Yeah.
getting to the preemption piece, sometimes states go above and beyond what the feds would be able to get passed and signed into
Yeah.
law. Sometimes states don't want to go as far for whatever their reasons are. So I agree, there have to be these common threads. And I think one of the things that NCSL, will work on, and we will propose this coming up in our meeting and then moving forward, is, do we want to come up with a set of principles that you can use at the state level, but also would be applicable at the federal level as well, if the feds are actually going to put a comprehensive piece of legislation together. So,
Okay, so I got that. Common sense should rule here is all I'm saying, Susan.
Yeah.
The second part of this is international, my view, is probably ahead of us and we're lagging. There are other efforts besides what you've cited. There's one called IPIE that kicked off 2 years ago, the International Panel on the Information Environment. And that is being done through a myriad of NGOs that are kind of coming together to try to bring all of the sciences, subtended by the Nobel Summit, by the way, to kind of say, you know what, we understand how this is done. We understand where the vulnerabilities are. We understand the consequences of our actions. Giving something like that voice through NCSL might not be a bad idea for you to take back as well.
totally agree.
Thank you.
Nick, thank you very much. And Susan, thank you very much. I think, I agree with you, like allowing sector-specific regulation. I think our goal, or my goal in our legislation, is to do general guardrails and then allow the sectors to get more specific, because I think that there's a knowledge that you need of how the AI would interact with the specific domain, right, within, whether it's healthcare or financial services or other areas that we're probably can't tackle everything at once. So, and then I will be seeing you, well, twice next week, once on Zoom, I think, and then
Yes.
I'll be down at DC as well. So I'm looking forward to that, meeting next week. So thank you.
Looking forward to having you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. And if you could please send those documents along, that would be fantastic.
Happy to do so. Have a good rest of your meeting.
Okay, thank you. Okay, MJ, is Beth?
Yes, Beth could be on.
Beth, I can see Beth right there. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, hello.
Hi, Beth. Thank you very much. And so the floor is yours.
Fabulous. Hello. For those of you, first, actually, thank you so much for having me here and for having Google here. And for those who don't know me, my name is Beth Tsai. I am the Director of Policy for Generative AI under the Trust and Safety team at Google. I'm going to, in the next kind of 30 minutes or maybe a little less, because I know we're running over time, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how Google is approaching generative AI with a view towards responsibility and safety. As you know, the generative AI genie is sort of out of the bottle. Everyone is moving quickly. Google obviously is moving quickly too, but one of our commitments is to make sure that we do so responsibly, right? So I'd like to kind of talk a bit about like how we're thinking about that. Let me see if I can present here. I'm not good at Zoom. I'm not gonna lie here, but let me see if I can do this.
Yeah, I always feel bad when I make someone use someone else's platform, right? So if it were Google Meets, we would have been.
You know what, I think I'm going to need to have my colleague Angela share it because it's muting me every time I try to share my screen. So Angela, would you mind? Apologies.
MJ, can you make sure Angela has the ability to share? Okay, great.
There we go. Wonderful. All right. Thanks, Angela. We can let you get started. If we go to the first slide, that would be fabulous. So look, I know that there's a lot of talk about AI these days, right? I mean, it's, you know, ChatGPT and DALL-E and Midjourney and yes, Google's Bard and stuff. And I know AI sounds like the new hotness, right? But I'm here to tell you that like AI has been around for a long time, right? In fact, like most of the time when you're engaging with Google's products, you're engaging with AI and you probably don't even know about it. So if you use Google Translate, that's like our AI systems running on the back end, helping you translate things. If you have a Pixel phone and you use Magic Eraser to like get rid of a random person in the background or like remove the leash from your dog or something like that, those are our AI systems working, right? And you've seen them on things like Google Lens and Smart Compose. Google AI has been underpinning our products for a long time, right? So when people start talking about AI and making it sound like it's scary and it's this new thing, you know, the first thing I like to tell them is that this is not a scary thing. This is not a new thing because you've been engaging with it for years now and you just haven't known about it, right? So it's not novel, it's not new, it's not scary. It's just now sort of like a light is being shined on it in a way that it wasn't before. So if you go to the next slide here, let me start out by just kind of making sure that we all kind of we all are on the same page. I think we talk a lot about, you know, AI and machine learning and all these things, but we often don't stop and think about like what they mean. So my goal in like the next 5 minutes of my talk here is for all of you who are listening to be able to like leave this talk and be like, oh, I can tell someone on the street like how generative AI works and like what generative AI is. All right. So let me see if I can do that. So most simply, we talk about AI and machine learning. What are those things? AI, really simple. That's just like making things smarter, right? Machine learning is at the heart of AI. That's the process of training computer systems to do things without specific programming, right? So once we can train computer systems to do things without programming, then we can focus on making them smarter. And that process of making them smarter, that is the AI process. So how do we do this? If we jump to the next slide, I just told you this. Machine learning is a new way of solving problems. We can go on. Okay, so let's look at a practical example, right? Let's talk about spam filtering, right? We've all used Gmail. We filter spam for you in that. We could do spam filtering like really crudely, right? We could look for sort of like keywords that spammers like to use, right? Like, you know, hot deals, buy now, stuff like that, right? And we could like have a list of those like phrases that spammers used, and we could tell our computer systems, hey, anytime you see an email that comes in that has those phrases, right? That spam, send it to the spam box, right? But that all is going to have limitations, right? Because that assumes a very narrow subset of emails. And if you jump to the next slide, I think this slide has animation, or maybe it's not showing up. Oh no. Well, it probably had beautiful animation, but I think it's not showing up. But like I said, you can imagine like how limited that can be, right? Because if a spammer gets smart, and we all know that spammers get smarter, right? They're going to realize like, oh, my emails get sent to your spam box if it uses these keywords. So I'm going to start using different keywords, right? And then spam gets through again. And so our filtering system just doesn't work. So we have to ask ourselves, like, what if we could actually like train our systems to identify spam, not based on keywords, but around like certain patterns of behavior, right? Some of which keywords are part of, right? And so that we didn't have to keep updating like a list of keywords, but our systems could just kind of intuitively look at an email and say, oh, that looks like spam. That's what machine learning does. If you go to the next slide. Oh no, I do not know why my images are not showing up on Zoom. Apologies, folks. Well, if you were looking at this here, you would see a picture of a furry animal, right? And I would ask you if this was a cat or a dog. And the fact of the matter is that sometimes we as humans, oh, there we go, there's my cat or dog. Sometimes we as humans look at a picture like this of a furry animal and we can't tell the difference if it's a cat or a dog, right? I mean, it kind of looks like it might be a cat, but maybe it's like a Pomeranian dog, right? Because it's fluffy, we can't tell. Machine learning systems have these problems too, right? This is what makes things so tricky when we're building machine learning systems, because we have to teach them that when you get an image like this, it is most likely a cat or it's most likely a dog. How do we do that? So if you go to the next slide. How do we do it? Through a lot of data. So imagine we're trying to teach a machine learning system what cats look like and what dogs look like, all right? We're gonna show that machine learning system tons of pictures of cats, and we're gonna label them as cats. Tons of pictures of dogs, we're gonna label them as dogs. And that system is gonna look at all these pictures and it's gonna like start to associate, okay, cat looks like this, it looks like this, it looks like this. Dog looks like this, it looks like this, it looks like this, right? So that eventually, when you show the system a picture, it'll be like, oh, that looks very similar to one of the hundreds of thousands of images of cats that you've shown me. And it can say authoritatively, that is a cat. That is fundamentally how training machine learning systems work. If you go to the next slide. So that's fundamentally how these systems work. The more we can show them in terms of data, the more pictures of cats, the more pictures of dogs, the easier it becomes for them to look at that furry picture there and say, that's a cat or that's a dog, right? And when I say a lot of pictures, a lot of data, I don't just mean hundreds, I don't just mean thousands, I don't just mean hundreds of thousands. We're filling them like huge sets, millions and millions of lines of data, right? Because the more data you can show them, the more pictures of cats, the more pictures of dogs, the more likely they are to be able to recognize what that is authoritatively. So you go to the next slide. So if that's fundamentally how machine learning works, how does generative AI fit into this? Generative AI is just a type of a machine learning system, except instead of predicting whether something's a cat or whether something's a dog or whether something's spam or whether something's not, a machine learning system simply predicts the next word in a sentence, all right? So how do we do that? We feed it tons and tons of sentences, right? Tons and tons of data. So it looks at sentences and it's like, sentences look like this. Words that are similar to this are generally preceded or succeeded by words that look like this. And when you ask a generative AI system like ChatGPT, like Bard, a question, it tries to answer it by like putting together word by word what it thinks would be a reasonable answer, what it thinks statistically based on what words go together. So you can see here, this is exactly what it's doing, right? In this image, it knows that after the word my, statistically, like the word name might come up more. And then after that, the verb is. And it's literally word by word, taking a best guess based on what it's been trained on, based on all the data it's looked at. It's taking a best guess what the next word's going to be until it forms a whole sentence. And I think this is like a really important thing to remember, because I think a lot of times we look at generative AI systems like Bard, like ChatGPT, and we think that they're actually like substantively answering a question, right? Like if you ask, what is the best like kind of sandwich, right? And it gives you an answer. We think, oh, it actually thinks that, it believes that. That's not the case at all. These systems, they don't think. They're not smart like that. They're just like trying to answer that question by spitting out words one by one that based on their training data makes sense statistically to be a good answer. That's how generative AI systems work. You go to the next slide. Oh no, it's taking so long to load. I think this is a slide that just didn't work. Why don't we skip it? There we go. So Bard, Google's chatbot, is a large language model text generation system, right? And so Bard, you've probably probably tried it, or maybe you tried ChatGPT and see something familiar. You literally type in a question and word by word, it's predicting an answer for you, right? Not because it's not spitting out an answer because it like knows something or has opinions or thoughts or feelings about something. It's just spitting out an answer that through its training data, through like statistical probabilities, it thinks makes sense. We go on to the next topic. Bard also engages with Google Lens, right? We use our machine learning image recognition systems in Google Lens very similarly to the kind of the cat and dog example I talked to you about to feed into Bard. So when you feed Bard an image in Google Lens, right? The Google Lens backend, which has been trained on the cats and the dogs and the image recognition, is looking at that and trying to tell you something about it. Keep going. So hopefully in those like that last section, you like have a basic idea of like how these systems work, right? So I'm going to tell you like, how do we make them safe? How do we build them in a responsible manner, right? Because I think this is like the hot topic that everyone is wondering about, right? You've got these systems, but how do you make sure that they're actually like safe and responsible? So the short answer to that question is through a lot of testing, all right? We can build these models and test them over and over to see how they're doing against all sorts of like safety topics, sexual content, hate, dangerous topics, terrorism, things like that. We test our models against those things. We look at the outputs and we can say like, oh, Bard gave a bad answer here. You know, Bard like, you know, gave you advice on how to do something terrible here, like build a bomb. Bard gave you a bad answer here about like hate speech or something like that. And when we look at the outputs from all of that testing we do, we can then take the bad answers, right? And tell Bard like, this is a bad answer, right? This is what a good answer looks like. We then like put all of that back into the model. We reteach it. Because remember, you can reteach the model over and over. This is a cat, this is a dog. The more you teach it, the better it gets, right? So the more we take the bad answers that we get, we fix them and we put them back into the model as good answers, the better it will get at like not making those mistakes. And that is fundamentally the process of like how we make these systems safer through constant like testing, retraining, and testing again. It's this whole cycle. Go to the next slide. One of the big kind of concerns around these models too is the notion of like bias, right? We don't want these models to say biased things. We want them to be neutral. They don't have opinions either, remember. They're just like spitting out word for word, but we don't want even you to think that they have opinions, right? They shouldn't, they should just be factual. So how do we teach them to do this? Well, we have something that we call, it's our neutral point of view framework, right? And so we train these models, again, through that cycle of testing and retraining and testing and retraining to follow this kind of like logic, right? If there is a consensus answer to a question, the model should answer with that. If there's not a consensus answer to a question, we want the model to give you multiple perspectives so that you can make up your own mind. It's like the start of a journey for you. You can look at different perspectives and decide what you think yourself. So let me show you kind of what that looks like with a very controversial question about hot dogs. Can we go to the next slide? So, is a hot dog a sandwich? This is a very controversial question because there isn't a consensus answer on this, right? So since there's no consensus answer, Bard is going to give you multiple perspectives. On the one hand, on the other hand, gives you both sides. You, as the reader, get to decide then what you think. Maybe then you'll do some more research and like come to a conclusion, right? But this is our perspective, like for how Bard should approach these controversial, these tricky questions where there isn't consensus. We want to just get you started on that information journey, right? And we're going to do that through giving you multiple perspectives. If we can keep going, I'm going to try to blow through these because I know we're running out of time and I want you guys to be able to stay on track. So let me talk to you about some of the other responsibility things that we do. So you heard me talk about testing and tuning, right? When we talk about testing, we do sort of two different types of things. One of the things that we do in testing is called red teaming, right? And it's a part of adversarial testing. And I think if you go to the next slide, I think I talk about red teaming. I'm not so sure. There we go, red teaming. So one of the best ways that we can test our products for bad answers is getting humans in the room and having humans literally zoom in on like certain areas that we want to make sure that we're good at and like ask the model as many adversary questions as they can in that regard, right? So you can imagine if like we were, you know, tuning on like terrorist content, if we wanted to red team on terrorist content, you could get red teamers in a room and they would ask the model hundreds of questions, anything that they could come up in their mind, trying to get the model to like, you know, say bad things about like terrorist content, right? We then take the results of those red teams. And just like I mentioned before, like that cycle, we look at the answers, we see where Bard gave bad answers. We like tell Bard that those answers are wrong and what a good answer to that question looks like, feed it back into the model, and then we red team again. And red teaming is really, really important because it allows us to really zoom in on specific types of badness and really like focus our attention on fixing problems. Right? If we go on to the next slide. Let me tell you another way that we like think is very important for kind of approaching these products responsibly, right? A lot of these generative AI products are still experiments. Bard is still an experiment. Search generative experiences, still an experiment, right? And so I think the most responsible thing that we can do in those situations is be gradual about how we deploy them, right? And that's why when we launched Bard, we started with a small trusted tester program. We onboarded users slowly. We've limited access to Bard to users under 18 at this point. Why? Not because we don't think that maybe there's use someday for kids to be able to engage in this model, but because we want to make sure that when vulnerable users like children engage with it, that the experience is appropriate for them, safe and appropriate for them. So the responsible thing to do is to like prevent under 18s from using Bard until we're confident that it is safe and appropriate for them, right? And then finally, like we launched Bard, we launched it in the US only, and we've only slowly been rolling it out globally, right? And this is another thing, like we can kind of test it in one market and then start to deploy it globally. And this ensures that we're gonna make sure that we address sort of some of the concerns that we've seen after the first launch, right? So it's slow and methodical, but it also is responsible. If we move on. I want to talk a little bit about user feedback. Because remember I talked a lot about, I should say, about that cycle of testing and retraining, and that's how we improve things. User feedback from real life users like you guys is critical to that. The more users give us feedback about if an answer was bad or not, the better our models can improve because we can put that feedback back into the model, retrain it, and have something better. So I can tell you that anytime you hit the thumbs down button to give user feedback on Bard, someone on my team in Trust and Safety, like an actual human being, is looking at that feedback and feeding it back into like the retraining queue, or deciding that like, you know, it actually isn't like, because, it actually isn't good feedback. Sometimes people will just like hit the button because they're unhappy that it thought that a hot dog was a sausage or something. If we can go on. I want to talk maybe in the last like minute about sort of the ecosystem and how we're thinking about it. So look, things like Bard, things like ChatGPT, image generators like Midjourney, right? Obviously, they are creating new risks, right? Particularly around fake content, deep fakes, right? And this is certainly something that we at Google are thinking a lot about. Now, I can tell you first, from a trust and safety perspective, these issues about like fake content, conspiratorial content, misinformation, things like this, these are issues we have been dealing with for time immemorial. We have policies in place, we have systems in place, right, to address this kind of content, right? The only thing that has changed here is not the nature of the content. We've been doing that for ages, right? It's the kind of barrier to entry, right? The content itself, the misinfo, it's the same. It's that now it's easier to make with these systems, right? And this is why we're leaning a lot on investing in detection systems. If you go to the next slide, synthetic media detection is going to be incredibly critical going forward to being able to combat things like deep fakes, all right? Now, the bad news here is like there is a lot of work that still needs to be done in this area, right? Detecting deep fakes is really hard. The good news is we are getting better at this. We actually have an audio detection system that like 98% of the time can identify if audio has been faked. We are working in the image generation space to try to be able to do the same, right? To try to be able to actively identify deep fake images. In the meantime, at Google, we're leaning it, not just Google, but across the industry, we're leaning into things like watermarks, right? Fingerprinting, hashing, which is another type of provenance. All of these are tools that allow us, when we produce images, to identify them as like coming from a certain company. This was created by Midjourney. This was created by DALL-E. This was created by Google, right? And that kind of, those provenance technologies allow us to say, like, if a deepfake image is out there, like, hey, that image is actually not real. It's a fake because I can look at the watermark. And this is going to be critical going forward, having things like watermarks across the industry. We move on to the next slide here. Another big thing, when we're talking about responsibility, you've heard me say like things like watermarking, provenance are critical across the industry. Here's the thing, Google cannot do it alone, right? We have to, as an AI industry, be coming together to support these responsible technologies, right? This is why, we've all come together for the White House commitments. This is why things like the Frontier Model Forum, which you recently heard, was stood up, which has a lot of the major industry players that are committing to like responsible development of new sort of emerging models. We're kind of starting to set standards in those areas, right? And this is why we also need your help as legislatures, your help as policymakers, because we can't do this alone, right? We think that this technology is so important, right? And this is why we need to work with you and work with our partners in the industry on this, about getting these safety standards right? Requiring things like watermarks, making sure that like testing, things like red teaming, like you heard me talk about, are like industry standards, because they are so critical to deploying these models responsibly. I think that's it for my slides. Yes, that is it. I know I'm 2 minutes over, apologies. I'm happy to take any questions, though, if you have time.
Yeah, I think, well, if you're okay with taking questions, I know we start about 9 minutes late, so we'll just go for another, 5 or 6 minutes. And I do see a question, and then I'll have questions maybe after that. Is Vahid, did I pronounce that correctly?
That's correct. Thank you so much, Beth, for this clarifying presentation. Google has been quite significantly more open with regards to their procedures than some of the major competitors. I was just reviewing the technical report on PaLM 2, which is a language model that fuels and powers BARD. It provides the details for how toxicity has been benchmarked. The data sets are listed, but when it comes to security testing, or when it comes to testing over different languages, the details are not provided. Is there a particular reason for this? Is that because Google wants to preserve or go down the path of security by obscurity, or are there other reasons involved here?
Yeah, so there's a very interesting thing here in that the PaLM model is actually like the underlying model that powers a lot of Google's generative AI efforts. So for example, it powers BARD, but it also powers Cloud, right? And it's what we call a base model. You can think of it as like the bottom layer of a layer cake, right? And it has certain protections baked into the model, but there's a whole nother layer that happens at the implementation layer when that model is turned into BARD, when it's turned into like the Cloud API that like clients can use, right? At those layers, additional safety protections, and those are like some of the most meaningful safety protections are put into place, right? So the PaLM report doesn't give you the full picture of the safety protections in place, because it's only talking about what fundamentally went into creating the base model. It's those like kind of upper layers with the Cloud API, with BARD, that have like the bulk of the things that are addressing things like security, that are addressing things like toxicity, that are addressing languages, right? So that's why you're not seeing those in those reports.
Thank you. Nick?
Why don't we let David go first and then I'll back clean up. David, go ahead.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Beth, for your presentation. Just a quick question. How does Google define consensus on a question? Is that a flat percentage or does it depend on the issue? Can you talk a little bit more about that process?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So if you've seen, for example, like, our knowledge panels on Google search, right? We use actually the exact same kind of method that they use for like identifying something's a fact or not. We look to authoritative sources. Those can be like primary sources. Those can be government bodies or government agencies, right? We look for like scientific consensus, right? As identified by like by large authoritative medical bodies or bodies like the United Nations, the CDC, other international ones like that. So we're generally looking to those kind of those global or national sort of standards that are being set. This is exactly what you're seeing on search when it comes to our authoritative consensus. So we just like kind of brought that notion over.
Hey, Beth, Nick D'Onofrio here. Thank you. Really well done. Kudos to you and to Google. And you're quite right. This has actually been around for 40 years, if you want the honest answer for how long this has been happening. And I got a couple of quick points to make. So one of the reasons it's coming to the forefront now is because the technology is there to make it more pedestrian, to make it, more easily accessible. And we have to keep reminding ourselves of that. And one of the things I'd ask you to think about at Google is the technology will continue to improve. The chips will get better. You will go back and embed into those chips a lot of what you're talking about right now. I'd like you to think about being transparent with us when you do that as well. When you're going back, to kind of rejigger, how those chips work, and therefore they will work faster and they will do, I think we need to know that too. And I think that's something that you should put on your list of things for Google to think about. The other thing you should put on the list is, I hear you on data, but this the source of the data that you want to question as well. Because I got the cat dog thing, similar things go on all the time, but I like your word. There is a tremendous amount of synthetic data out there that is going to actually, at the primitive end of this, give you all the wrong answers. And getting all the way back to that, not just watermarking whether it's a cat or a dog, or it's a sandwich or not, you got to get all the way back to the source of that data and grind your way through satisfying that as you put it into the model, you're going to get good results. So I know you know this. I know Google thoroughly understands this, but more of that, I think, as you talk, is probably going to be important because that's where I'm going to be focusing. Mm-hmm. I love your definitions. They're all solid. They're all straightforward. So thank you very much, Beth, for your commitment here, for Google's commitment. And we just want to make sure that you stay with us because it'll get tougher as we go forward. It won't get easier.
No, thank you so much for your thoughts. And I know I've got my colleagues from public policy on the call who I'm sure are making note of this, but we really do appreciate your partnership here.
Thanks, Nick, and thanks, Beth. I do have questions, but I will reach out. I didn't know if you would be able to send us the PowerPoint so we could send that out to the members of the task force, as well as if there are any other documents that you think would be useful to disseminate to members of the task force. I believe you do have a document on how you're implementing or the implementation is going for the voluntary commitment to the White House. That would be helpful. And then just, questions that I'm thinking of, we're talking, the red teaming and also the user feedback. So, bug bounties, borrowing from cybersecurity, how do we incentivize those things in policy and give you assurances as a company to want to incentivize that feedback, right? So that we're not being punitive, but we're helping to improve the model. The other thing is, as we look at potentially requiring testing, one of the things I'm thinking of is, I see, the generative AI as a great ability to kind of democratize programming, right? That it can write the coding, that we can get people involved in developing apps and other things who may not have a coding background. And so how do we create tools, or where is the testing going to be required? Obviously, you have to test the underlying model, but then if I'm retraining to put a chat bot on, is it necessary, or is it only if I'm significantly changing the use case? Because I know as the models open up through APIs and other ways for people to interact and put their creativity to work, we want to make sure that that's safe. But again, if it's a smaller scale company, they might not have the same capability. We develop sandboxes for them to test, or where and how often, and again, frequency of testing is hard to define but just encouraging ongoing testing. So any thoughts on those? Obviously not to answer now, but those are just to kind of signal what I'm thinking, the questions that are I'm thinking as we try to develop policy.
Hey, James, if I could jump in here, and I'm sorry, your point's more valuable than you probably even think, because we were only talking about large language models. These are public, commercial, democratized things. But the real either value or damage is likely to be done by a localized language model. And we haven't talked specifically about those localized language models, meaning put it into healthcare, put it into finance, put it into commerce, put it into trade, put it into travel and transportation. So it's somewhere along the line, and I know Google understands this, these large language models, they just happen to be the shiny object right now. They are not likely where real value will be created. Real trouble could be created, but not real value. So that's going to be another thing I think we're going to have to debate here, James.
Thanks, Nick. And I do see one last question before we move on. George?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you. So this is for Beth. There are two issues that we will need to confront. Now we are going to be launching Gemini in the next few days by Google, which surpasses Palm, which brings in more complexity to the whole thing. We are going to be mandating later or crafting the bylaws. Another thing is Watermark itself. We can't control that with the open source resources now that is being developed all over the world. Google may be able to compartmentalize it with Gemini, but that is not something that we will have to address at a later point for the general conversation here. Thank you.
Yeah, and actually, I will say on that last point, I think, this goes to sort of what I said at the end about, I think it's critical for the whole industry, as well as policymakers like yourself, to come together on this, because the more folks that we can have who are like committing to watermarking, to provenance type solutions, right? The less content there's going to be out there that we have to rely on detection tools. Detection tools are always going to be the critical, like it's a two-pronged process, right? But the more that we can catch proactively, through things like watermarking, hashing, fingerprinting, I think it's going to be better. And that's why, cooperation and collaboration across the industry and with the public sector is incredibly important.
So Beth, one more question, and then I'll keep quiet. Things are happening so dynamically, almost on a weekly basis. In your from your perch, is there a group that our body could to listen to that's involved in watermarking and the security realm that Google is already working with in terms of partners? I've been talking to the Allen Institute up in the other end of the state, as well as the one across the pond, Alan Turing, but there's no body, as I understand, that comes together and talk about watermarking or various elements that we are in the hole at this juncture. Is Google planning to help create such a consortium or a coalition or something that we could our state could get, our team could get involved in, engaged in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to kind of give you like a little bit of a hand wavy answer here. I mean, obviously we are engaged with our industry partners across things like the Frontier Model Forum and whatnot. However, I'm going to suggest that my public policy colleagues connect with you about where they think that is the best place for you folks to plug in, because kind of we're engaged as across a number of technical forums, and it's unclear to me sort of which one of those would be the best place for you to engage. So we'll take a follow-up on that.
Thank you very much. I think Matt Lenz from Business Software Association has something to add in that regard.
Yeah, thanks, Senator. Just very quickly, but I know the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, which is a number of industry stakeholders as well as news groups like BBC, New York Times, have come together. Adobe and Microsoft are helping lead that. But they're working on the watermarking issue, hashing, and then I think an important part of this is making sure that media is using this type of material, right? Because it's really going to depend on them to really help bring this to the forefront. So that might be one area that we could look at, and I'm happy to connect this group or you, George, with them.
Great, thank you. And I think, Matt, that's an excellent point in that the content authenticity or the digital watermarking, however, isn't enough. It's that how do we require then that when these images that have been generated by AI are shared, should that be indicated on the site that's sharing them? And if it's, again, if they're recognizing that whatever the metadata or whatever, however it's identified that it's been generated. So those are policy issues I think we'll have to look at. Beth, thank you so much for your presentation.
No, thank you folks for having me here. And as always, please feel free to reach out to myself and my colleagues if we can help you in any other ways.
Thank you.
Have a lovely day.
Thanks, you as well. Okay, and next we have Avi Fell and Eric Aldana.
Hi, Senator Maroney. Thank you so much. So I think we have some slides, which I'll try to share here if I can. And let me know if you can still hear me. Perfect.
Yes, I can still hear you and see the slides.
Excellent. So thank you so much, Senator Maroney, for inviting us to speak today to the Connecticut AI Task Force. Thank you also for giving us the chance to speak with you previously about all of the work that we're doing at Credo AI. My name is Avi Felli, and I'm Global Policy Director at Credo AI. I'm based in Washington, D.C., and I lead our policy team. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Eric Aldana, who is on our tech policy product team and leads all of our work on product. So thank you so much for the opportunity for us to present today. I wanted to just quickly review what we're going to chat about. So we'll just give you a brief introduction of what we do at Credo. So what our platform is, our research into different types of governance artifacts, and specifically our research on impact assessments. So I really liked what Beth said about the fact that AI is not novel, it's not new, and it's not scary. And I think we want to make the same points for transparency reporting and documentation governance artifacts overall. And they're also not new, they're not novel, and they're not scary. And that's a big part of the work that we do at Credo is trying to enable organizations of all sizes to document how they are using AI, explain how they're using it, and manage and track risk across all of their AI use cases. So we are the leading responsible AI governance platform, the leading SaaS platform for AI governance for enterprises of all sizes. And what we wanted to talk to you about today is specifically how we can help enterprises develop AI at scale that is compliant, safe, secure, fair, and human-centered. So it's our strong mission and belief that companies developing and deploying AI should be able to track, assess, report on, and manage their AI systems. And that's what our platform enables companies to do. And this is something that all companies should be able to do, not just larger companies or companies that have existing experience with risk management or have large compliance teams or legal teams. This is something that should not be a barrier to using and developing AI for enterprises of any size. And that's really our mission. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Eric, to explain a little bit more about how our platform works.
Thanks, Avi. And in lieu of a full platform demo or anything like that, really just want to quickly talk through what the workflow for responsible AI governance looks like, right? So we're a responsible AI governance platform. Essentially what this means is that we're going to have our customers, our partners go through 4 steps. First off, they're going to register their AI systems. They're going to say, these are the AI systems that we're either in the process of building, actively deploying, or purchasing from a vendor. They're going to apply controls. So this is where they decide what are the actual requirements, what are the governance rules that we want to follow to make sure that our systems are acting responsibly. And these come from laws, regulations, as well as industry standards, guidelines, and even internal best practices. So these are controls like making sure that we're measuring for bias using particular metrics, or ensuring that if we are using generative AI systems, we are disclosing that information to the end users. The third step is to gather and evaluate evidence. This is where evaluations are done on systems to show that they are compliant with those controls that we've adopted. And then finally, generate reporting artifacts. And these could be a variety of different types of reports. It could be model cards, impact assessments, dashboards, and also provided to a variety of different stakeholders. So if you're an executive making an internal decision or a regulator that needs to make a decision whether or not to allow this the system to stay on the market, these artifacts are really kind of the instruments of trust building that's so necessary for this space. And so we're going to dive a little bit into what makes good reporting artifacts. Senator Maroney, you asked specifically about impact assessments, so we'll make sure to dive into that. But yeah, just a quick overview of that governance process, and I'll hand it back over to Avi.
Thanks, Eric. So the slide is just to illustrate that there are many different types of what we refer to as governance artifacts. So when thinking about how to increase transparency, these are all different methods in which to do so. So different tools in the regulator or policymaker's toolkit. There are model cards, system cards, bias audit reports, impact assessments, which we'll talk a little bit more about, design evaluations, technical documentation. This is the specific term used in the EU AI Act, amongst others, publishing reports, and annual audits. So algorithmic impact assessments, in our research, they're generally created and reviewed before a system is put into use. And the details that are included in this impact assessment include the use of the AI system, its specific use case and context, even when the deployment, the specific use case and context of the deployment is known. So it's important that we note that this research is still ongoing into what a good algorithmic impact assessment looks like, but there's certainly precedent for requiring this and mandating this from companies. And that's kind of what we want to talk about today in a little bit more detail. So Eric, I'm actually going to ask you to talk about this slide where we've just given some examples of reporting requirements that already exist at the city and state level, federal level, and global level, just to give you an overview of what already exists in terms of transparency reporting requirements.
Sure, thanks, Avi. And yeah, hopefully folks on this call are somewhat familiar with some of these elements. I know that in Senator Blumenthal's opening remarks, he talked about the idea of a bias audit for hiring. This is something that's coming straight from New York City Local Law 144, which requires folks who are using automated decision-making systems for hiring and employment to provide a bias audit publicly. And really kind of the point of this slide is to show that right now there are a bunch of different transparency and reporting requirements and that have different purposes that are made for different audiences, right? Some of these reports are geared toward being public for anyone to make a decision on and to understand. Some are really focused on providing information for regulators. Some are required to be performed by a third-party auditor. Some are required, some can be done by the organization, the builder and developer themselves. And so really we just want to share, there's a wide variety of different expectations out in the market right, or out in the ecosystem right now, which creates a lot of compliance and consistency challenges for a lot of our customers.
So again, highlighting here that it's our view that trust is a bigger piece of friction than compliance in this ecosystem. And so introducing transparency reporting requirements for companies that are developing and deploying AI is really critical because that's what builds trust. And again, while we appreciate all of the efforts and support all of the efforts for voluntary commitments, it is important to think about how policymaking can serve as providing mandatory guardrails, which increases the probability that companies, that enterprises will invest in both the staffing, the tools, the teams that they need to take risk management seriously when developing and deploying an AI system. There's a lot of precedent for impact assessments, so just highlighting some sectors here that already have impact assessment requirements. Privacy impact assessments are required in Section 208 of the E-Government Act of 2002. The Department of Homeland Security, for example, conducts a privacy impact assessment when deploying and developing or procuring any new technology and systems that handle or collect PII, personally identifiable information, creating a new program, system, technology, or information collection that may have privacy implications, and when updating a system that results in new privacy risks. There's also an alpha version of an algorithmic impact assessment in AIA that was published by the CIO Council for voluntary use by federal agencies. And Section 207 of the American Data Privacy Protection Act proposed legislation, which I think has already been reviewed by the NCSL, is another great example of an algorithmic impact assessment and algorithm design evaluation. So just diving a little bit deeper into the ADPA design evaluation example, it emphasizes that evaluations must occur at the design phase. So it's really two different pieces of Section 207 of the text, the design evaluation and the impact assessment, which together are designed to increase transparency for companies that are developing and deploying AI. The design evaluation, as this slide lists, is focused on the design phase. An external independent researcher or auditor should conduct the evaluation, and then the evaluation is required to be submitted to the FTC no later than 30 days after its completion. The impact assessment includes all of these elements. So again, this is the ADPA example, but a detailed description of the design process and methodologies of the algorithm, a statement of its purpose, its proposed uses, its foreseeable capabilities, the data inputs, the outputs, and the necessity and proportionality of the algorithm in relation to its purpose, and steps to mitigate potential harms. This is really a critical piece of all of the transparency reporting targeted at enterprises that are developing and deploying AI is, if something goes wrong, if a harm occurs, have you attempted to foresee what those harms could be and what you will do if something happens. I'm going to turn it over to Eric for this slide, which describes a little bit more about how you can think critically about the audience for the transparency reporting itself.
Sure, yeah, and so whenever we've had a chance to talk with a number of our partners, other regulators, discussing what ultimately makes for a good transparency report or a governance artifact, and there is no one size fit all solution for what that is. And so what we've started to put together are a series of questions or criteria that could hopefully guide you toward, what that report looks like for your purpose. And so, just these questions are the things we ultimately hope, by answering you can get there. The first question being, how does the report that you're generating ultimately address risk, right? What is the ultimate purpose of this report? Are you trying to promote public transparency and accountability for companies? Are you trying to actually say that there are specific requirements that you need to meet, and you're going to show in this report that you've met these requirements or not, so you're preventing or guiding behavior explicitly? Are you just setting the table stakes for what good looks like? You're asking companies to say, hey, this is what our metrics on bias or our metrics on performance are, because we don't have standards of what good are. And so we're starting to just show what are the table stakes, what is out there right now, so we can actually develop new policy going forward. This is sort of kind of the approach that the New York City law is taking when it comes to bias audits. Another question is actually, who's consuming the report? Are they non-technical stakeholders? Are they technical stakeholders? Is it the public? So for the California for CCPA, when they have impact assessments related to algorithmic systems, the point of that impact assessment is to allow any sort of consumer to decide whether or not they want their data to be used to train systems. So this is just an ordinary citizen, not necessarily someone with a technical background. So making sure that understanding who's reading the report is and who it's intended for is captured. What are the report requirements? Here's the next step. Are we documenting just processes or decisions that are related to the development of the system? Are there actual metrics that we want to have, evaluations? How do we know whether or not those evaluations are good and appropriate for the context that the system is being deployed in? What AI system components are being covered by these requirements? Beth in the last presentation brought up a great point, the distinction between regulating a base model versus the actual application that model is being used for. Those are going to have different requirements, and we want to be clear what is it that we're actually asking to create a transparency report for. And then finally, to that point, are the requirements themselves actually clear? We've seen a lot of historically examples where, because the requirements are unclear, ultimately the reports have kind of, there's been a race to the bottom. I think when GDPR first came out with data privacy impact assessments, the definition of risk was very unclear. And as a result, a lot of the data protection authorities didn't have a lot of ability to have more restrictive requirements or specific requirements. And as a result, became very difficult to enforce. So making sure that requirements are clear is really key, and working with companies and folks who are going to be creating these reports to make sure that the requirements are understood by all the parties that are going to be creating the reports. And then finally, who's conducting the report? Are we allowing companies internal teams to create those reports themselves? Do we want a separate auditor, which of course is going to create additional resource restraints? Is that auditor going to be government? Is it going to be a third-party private auditor, or regulators? So those are some questions, and we'll share these slides because we know there's a lot to go through with limited time. And we're happy to answer any questions. And finally, so we asked some questions, but as far as our what we've seen and kind of any sort of recommendations we might make, we want to leave with these 3 points. And first off, impact assessments, there really should be a focus on establishing transparency to show that there is validity in them, to show that we're able to develop trust. And these can be either done by making the impact assessments publicly available for anyone to look at, making it open to watchdog organizations to verify validity, or at the very least, requiring an external auditor, whether it is government or not, to provide some sort of certification or understanding that we've looked at these reports and we can verify their validity. The second piece, context. This is something we've heard a lot over the last couple of hours, making sure that any reports or impact assessments are reflecting the deployment context of the AI system, right? What sort of industry is it being used in? There are going to be a bunch of different benchmarks and requirements based on context. And while it is, really enticing and attractive to potentially have a one-size-fits-all solution, usually that's going to mean that specific requirements, specific nuances of the system are going to be left out and less useful as a result. And then finally, when we talk about impact assessments, we want to talk about both, what is the realized impact? What are actual incidents that have occurred after using the system? And these can be done by, post-deployment, what have been some negative incidents that have happened or adverse incidents. And then also in testing the system, how is it performed, making that information available. So realized impact as well as potential impact. So identifying, what could possible risks be, and what are the mitigation steps that folks are taking, even if they have not yet been realized or both in the future. So we work with a number of different companies, small, medium businesses, startups, large Fortune 500 companies who all want to develop and deploy AI systems, whether they're building it themselves or using a vendor system. And like Avi mentioned, the biggest friction that we're seeing for the adoption of AI, the biggest friction to this key aspect of innovation is lack of trust, right? Companies want to know if they can trust their systems, what good looks like for the systems that they're building and they're buying. And so these transparency reports and impact assessments are such a crucial part of this. yes, they provide some friction when it comes to compliance, but help smooth out the greater friction that comes from this lack of trust. So we're really grateful for all the vital work that you're doing here in this regard, and happy to answer any questions that you have about this presentation. Otherwise, thanks.
Eric, thank you very much. Avi, thank you very much. I'm going to start with a few questions because I don't see any hands raised. So the hands came up. I'll go ask one and then I'll go later on. But I like the way you framed it because I was actually thinking of my questions in the what, how, who. So in talking, I've been thinking of impact assessments mainly because that's what we had done with our data privacy. We required the data impact assessments. Some of this is looked at, what we'll be looking at, but I'm wondering if I'm thinking of it the wrong way in that we don't need to specify that it's an impact assessment. We just need to say what information we need, because I know that currently OpenAI, I believe, uses system cards, right? So is that something to consider as being a little more agnostic as to the type of governance artifact, but just looking at requiring the information we need? The other thing is it's interesting on who the audience, you bring up who the audience is, because currently our data impact assessments are private, and if they can be requested by the Attorney General, and it doesn't waive the confidentiality, right, doing that. So I think that you get different levels of reporting depending on the audience. So what, and again, you probably can't answer this now. If you can, that would be great. But otherwise, we can follow up. Should we look at different requirements for what should be publicly disclosed, as in like I guess something akin to a privacy statement, an AI statement, or whatever we'll call it, versus what the Attorney General may request if they had to do some form of an enforcement action. And then the other interesting, and I think this was in an article Amy just shared from her LinkedIn, but like who, right? Who does the testing? And I like again, how do we use the learnings from cybersecurity to apply to this? But yeah, it's a lot to unpack right there. So anything you can answer. Also, I checked on LinkedIn and I didn't realize you were a whiff before I I saw that on LinkedIn. So I'll just drop it.
No, thank you, Senator. I think we'll try to answer as many as we can, and I see more popping up. I would say that from our perspective, the flexibility is fine in terms of what the evaluation is called. I think certainly looking to the research community and grounding the requirements in what the AI research community and AI governance community has found to be most effective would be a great place to start, particularly when thinking about making sure that all of the entities that will be responsible for producing this type of documentation and reporting understand what it is that they're doing. There's a significant amount of translation work that has to be done between a product manager, a data scientist, computer scientists, a compliance and legal team to make sure that everyone is on the same page. So I would say I'm not sure that I am the one to say there's one consensus around this particular type of term, impact assessment, model card, but it is really important, I think, to look to the research community as to what makes sense from their perspective. I think from our perspective, it's about what is required to be provided in terms of technical and non-technical evidence. And that's really where there should be more granularity to the extent possible of naming elements that will be included in the transparency report, the impact assessment, the model card. Some of these elements can be provided if the end use is known, and some cannot. Some require knowing the end use and some do not. So I think that there's a lot of flexibility in that regard. But I again want to touch on the fact that for most enterprises, figuring this out is not a challenge, but it's certainly not a priority if it isn't required and if it isn't mandatory. So to the extent that the guardrails can be mandated, I think we'll see a lot more investment from enterprises in determining this. And Eric, I think maybe you want to jump in on the audience question.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. I think really the question, like one of the questions underlying who is the audience of the impact report is who should be making the decision about what systems we should be deploying and how they should be deployed, right? When we are saying that, we want to make transparency requirements open to the public, we are saying, we are allowing the public to make decisions about, whether or not they want to give their data to these systems, whether or not they want to buy these systems. And in many cases, we're already allowing the public to make these sorts of decisions. One of the reasons I got so into this space was because just a few years ago, it was on the California ballot to decide whether or not we're going to allow algorithms to decide who gets bail or not. Any voter in California got to make that choice. And so they should have the information, right, about these systems that are being used. And so that would be an example, right? If we're giving the power to people, they should have information as well. If we want to give the power of deciding to experts, to regulators, which, to be fair, is sometimes the right decision, then that's where the information should be going to and who those transparency reports should be geared toward. But really, it starts from that political question first: who gets to decide?
Thank you, and I will follow up with both of you with more questions, but I'm going to open it up to others. One thing, Avi, if you could share any of the research on what good governance looks like, or just point me in some directions, that would be great. I think it's Matt, and then Vahid, and then Nick.
Thanks, Senator. And I know we're coming close on time here, but being I represent the industry that largely represent a lot of enterprise software companies. So this is an issue that we've been talking about for years. And BSA's produced a framework in 2021 before the NIST framework calling for impact assessments. And then just as recently as the last week, our president and CEO presented to the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science and Transportation, calling for impact assessments for high risk use for Congress to legislate that. So it's something we take seriously. Couple of comments, and I know we're running up on time, so we can follow up later, but I'd really be interested to know where you see the distinction between developers and deployers. They're each going to have different information that should be required, similar to how we do in privacy with controllers and processors. So certainly something we should look at. And then, there's plenty to talk about, I think, with, who should be seeing the impact assessments. Right now, there's no third-party credentialing body. I know there's some international bodies looking towards that, but I'm sure to go that angle without folks coming together and at least setting standards internationally. So more comments and questions for later, but thank you for the presentation.
Thanks, Matt.
Yeah, happy to chat more on that. I think, again, just reacting quickly to that, I think that there is still discussion on the global stage of how you make this distinction. And for us, I think the responsibility should increase as you have more impact on the design and development of the system itself. But that's not to say that there shouldn't be responsibilities for quote unquote downstream developers, because that's a wide swath of companies that are either fine tuning large language models or using other methods to kind of build upon what the original developer of the model has designed. And they are also responsible for understanding the model inputs, how it was trained, expected and unexpected outcomes. That's our perspective, but happy to share more on that.
Thank you. Vahid.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Avi and Eric, for a wonderful presentation. As in the course of your work at Credo, have you come across any cases where the regulatory requirements fail to conform to the tech? And for instance, I suspect that reinforcement learning may not be at the forefront of how these regulations were designed, particularly when it comes to fairness and bias assessment and then audits. I'm curious if my suspicion is correct and if there are other instances of regulation not conforming to the actual technology.
Great. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, happy to take that and dive into it more. And I would say that definitely there are areas where there is lack of clarity, right? I think, none of the laws that are related to bias in lending or loan, applications are going to consider things like, reinforcement learning, generative AI. There are model risk management frameworks that have, gone back for decades, but certainly, they're not capturing kind of, the state of the art today. That being said, I think there's also risk of taking the opposite approach, which is getting too specific, right? In terms of like, here are the specific metrics that we want for today's models, for today's systems. We're starting to see some regulators starting to think that way, right? They want to be able to say, here's the metric we're going to use for bias, and this is going to be codified in law or regulation. There is a risk to that, right? Then, once you decide here is the actual standard, it becomes brittle. And then 6 months from now, or, at the rate of, how technology is progressing, maybe even, a few weeks from now, it's going to be out of date. And so, there's always kind of that tension between, making sure that like requirements are clear, but also, not necessarily brittle. And I think part of that too is just ensuring that all of the different people who have a role in deciding, how to interpret laws. So both the writers of the laws and regulations themselves, the courts that make a decision, the sorts of lawsuits that come out, all kind of are coordinating in lockstep to ensure that, we know what the questions are, right? We know where the lack of ambiguity are, and that there's a coordinated effort to ensure like how we answer those. So not a very specific, not showing any answers. I would actually say that right now it is still kind of too early for specific regulations to have gotten things wrong based on what they've said. There are definitely gaps, but yeah, that would be kind of our take now.
Yeah, and if I could just add briefly to that, I would say one of the things we talk a lot about is a set of metrics as opposed to one metric being a much more effective way to evaluate models.
Thank you. And I think, Eric, you point out one of the risks always when trying to pass legislation, especially related to tech, is that technology advances much more rapidly than our ability to regulate it. And so we don't want to codify things that will be obsolete. And how do we build flexibility? And it's hard, right? How do you get granular when we don't know how things may be used? People are envisioning new ways of using it, although that is one of the knocks from what I've heard on the EUA AI Act impact assessments, that there isn't enough guidance. So it's going to be difficult. How do we strike that balance? But thankfully, there are a lot of smart people on the group, much smarter than I, like Nick, who's going to ask his question now, and I'll let him.
I'm so sorry. So sorry, Senator. So look, I mean, I'm just going to kind of repeat what you just said. So Eric and Evie, thank you very much. I think it's very important, the work that you're doing, and I appreciate it. But this ownership of responsibility is a big deal. And I don't think we can, you can't propagate, I'm passing on my responsibility to you. That's not going to work. So that value chain, Eric and Evie, has going to have to be owned, right? Whether it's upstream, downstream, I don't care where you are in the stream. If you created it, it's yours. And I'd ask you to kind of think about building that in, because let's not be foolish here. Everyone who is working on this stuff knows exactly what the problems are that they're creating. And it's naive of us to think that they don't. These are smart people. They know exactly what they're doing. They know why they're doing it, and it's very purposeful. And I think we have to stay focused on the fact that you just can't reach in, do something, touch something, and then reach out and say, that's not my fault. I don't believe that. I just do not. I'm a technologist at heart, a business person second. So I don't believe any of this stuff. I think people do know exactly what they're doing, why they're doing it, and they understand those consequences. And it's our job to figure out how to get them to cough it up. Just be transparent. I mean, we need to know that risk and have it rendered explicit. I will close by saying there are regulated industries in this country, and they're going to regulate these things. I mean, you did touch on my comment about localized language models, and thank you for picking up on that. I mean, trust me, the financial services community is going to continue to be regulated, and what they do and what happens with AI is going to be regulated, as are the other regulated industries. So that's a foregone conclusion in my mind. Aligning with them to understand what they're thinking, where they're going. I mean, and you don't get a pass in financial services. It's not my fault. What you get is a fine. You get a judgment against you in the financial services industry. And it's not like, well, it wasn't my fault that Google did this, or IBM did this, or Microsoft did this, or fill in the blank did this. hey, no, it is your fault. So I'm passionate about this chain of custody, this chain of risk not being passed from one person to another. You're in it, you own it, and we're going to figure out who you are. And that will be part of the work that I think with the senator and his colleagues we're going to end up having to do here. So thank you. I'm sure I'll be back to you many more times.
Please do. Please consider us a resource.
Senator, if I may.
Yes.
Thank you, Evie. Thank you, Eric. I just want to follow up a little bit with what Dr. Vahid had shared about RLs. As I understand yesterday at the UN Assembly, we are now talking about transactional AI. We have passed foundational AI. So I'm looking at Credo as a tool that our state could explore. And I remember asking your CEO a couple of months ago, Ms. Singh, when it was foundational AI, what happens when it moves? How are you going to know what's in the guts of these models when they are talking to each other, absent of our presence and our knowledge? How do we govern something that we can't see, smell, touch, or know? So when it becomes transactional AI, where does reinforced language models going to be? And obviously this is too early to figure that out, but it is something that I would like Credo to figure out and measure with all those think tanks that we could adapt. I mean, things are happening, as I said, too rapidly. There is no one solution that fits all, but I would like Credo to be thinking about transactional AI going forward and how we could use you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, George. If I could just come in on that quickly, I think certainly excited to think about that and partner. But again, one of the biggest difficulties for enterprises in this space is just understanding basic risk management and very basic compliance or basic transparency documentation. So it's really, I would say, as important to us that being able to register your AI use case, understand how you're using AI across your enterprise, and understand how it's changing, how it's being trained. Even these, I think, seemingly simple or quote unquote dated aspects of AI governance still need to happen very much so on the large scale. So that's also still very much a priority for us.
Great. Thank you, George. Thank you, Avi. Thank you, Eric, for your presentation. And if you wouldn't mind sharing, some of the resources discussed, but then also your slides so that we can summarize everything and send it out to all of the members, that would be great. And I'm sure we'll also be in touch with you as we continue, as this is the first meeting and we have a long way to go. So thank you.
Sounds great. Thank you,
Senator. Thanks, everyone, for the great questions.
And with that, that's the last of our presentation. So we're going to do things a little backwards, I guess, and that we will now go through before we wrap up and just introduce the members of the task force. And again, for those who've been involved before, the working groups, this is a little different. The task force did have in the legislation, Senate Bill 1103, there were specific appointing authorities. And so there were very specific appointments. So we'll start. And I'm just going to ask you to just say a brief introduction of yourself as I read off the names. So we'll start with George Mathenu.
George Mathenu. I reside in Groton, Connecticut. I sit on a couple of the state investment boards, CT&X, CT Minority Investments. In the past, I was a catalyst for fintech back in 2000, as well as what we call cybersecurity, but in those days we call it information security, and have become an investor subsequently. After that, we invested in all across Europe and Asia Pacific. We were, at that time, we wouldn't call a VC, but we were just a private equity company under Deutsche Bank. And now I'm sort of I don't like to use the R word, but something like the R word. So I enjoy emerging technologies too much, perhaps. That's my background.
Thank you, George. Next, Vahid.
I'm Vahid Behzadan. I'm an assistant professor of computer science and data science at the University of New Haven, and I'm also the founding director of a research lab there called Secure and Assured Intelligent Learning, or SAIL for short, where my team and I work on technical problems in AI safety and security. I do not have a legal background, but I hope to be able to contribute with technical commentary, like why the definition of AI in the bill classifies mechanical thermostats as AI. And with that, I yield the floor.
Thank you. Point well taken on definitions, and we don't want to inadvertently draw on chatbots or other low-risk activities, and be more specific on, I mean, it's key that we maintain definitions across states for interoperability, but also that we're not inadvertently drawing in processes, because AI really is a very broad topic. So I think being more specific when we speak is important as well. Thank you. So David Desroche.
Hi, yeah, David DeRoche. I am an adjunct professor of journalism and film at Quinnipiac University, and my actual title is Director of Community Programming there. I come from a journalism background. I covered a lot of stories related to predictive algorithms used by public agencies, and some of the problems that, or the pitfalls that agencies would find themselves in as they deployed some of these predictive algorithms. So I have a particular interest in that. I just wanted to make one statement just to push back a little bit on so the consensus that we have about the experts sort of know, all the things that there is to know about these models. I feel like, in my conversations with people who create these, a lot of them don't know why machines make a decision. And we only know of the issues that we have experienced. We cannot foresee future problems that haven't occurred yet. And so I think a challenge for us is going to be really to dig into what issues that have not occurred that could potentially occur, and thinking of our framework under that lens. So I had a lot of things I wanted to talk about, but I know we got a lot of work to do over the next few months, so I'll yield the floor on that.
Yeah, and it's the unknown unknowns that are always the hardest to legislate for, and building the flexible legislation. Thank you. Joseph, I'm sorry, Chris Gilrain. Okay. Joseph DeMarco. Okay. Matt Lenz.
Thank you, Senator. My name is Matt Lenz from BSA, the Software Alliance. We are a global trade association representing the global enterprise software industry. So we operate across about 37 countries. Been very focused, laser focused on AI the last few years, specifically on AI use in automated decision tools for high risk use. So talking about employment, healthcare, et cetera. Our president and CEO advises the president as her role on the National Artificial Intelligence Advisory Committee. Been very active in the EU on the EU Act, and of course here in the States, working with Senator Maroney and then folks, and I know we'll get to AB 331 at another meeting. So very, very hot on that. So happy to be here and looking forward to working with you all.
Thanks, man. Christian Troncoso. Okay, David Ferrucci. Okay, and then Jinbo B.
Yes. My name is Jimba B. I am a professor in the Department of Computer Science and Engineer in the University of Connecticut. I'm also a founder and director of the Laboratory of Machine Learning for Health Informatics. So I do research in explainable AI, trying to improve the interpretability of the machine learning models. I'm very glad to be here. This is the first time for me to join. Sorry. This is the first time for me to join a task force working group, and I'm hoping to help with whatever definition or technology related questions or issues that need to be addressed.
Thank you very much, Dr. V, and we'll be sure to lean on your expertise. I think that'll be very helpful. So next, we'll go to the ex officio members. So Rep. D'Agostino, myself, Lauren Bidra from the Attorney General's office.
Thank you, Senator Maroney, and good afternoon. I'm Lauren Bidra. I'm Special Counsel for Media and Technology with the Attorney General's office. I'll be the designee for this task force. I'm working on legal and policy issues in this space, doing a lot of work with social media platforms, as Senator Blumenthal mentioned about the genie being out of the bottle, working on some of that. And I'm looking forward to working with you all on this task force. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And from the Comptroller's office, Yamuna Manan. Okay. Well, Mark Raymond from DAS.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Senator, for having me here. I am the Chief Information Officer for the state of Connecticut, and a little bit of the sort of nexus of several of you folks here. So I graduated from Jinbo's program long before she was there. So I am a proud computer engineering rep from UConn. I did 21 years in private industry, starting from an area of technical architecture. So Nick, I can relate to that from your background. And for the last 12 years, have been the CIO for the state of Connecticut. So happy. So many of the activities that we talked about today around governance and improving, at least as it relates to statewide technology, fall under my domain. Really happy to be a part of this group and contribute in any way that I can. So thank you.
Mark, thank you so much. Scott Gall, the Chief Data Officer. And because we ran over, I think some of the people may have dropped off who were on before. So Colleen Murphy, Executive Director of the FOI Commission.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Senator Maroney, for today's presentations. I found them extremely valuable, not being a technical person and learning from each of those speakers. So thank you very much. And I'm really glad to be here as well. I've spent my professional career as working in the field of open government. I'm now the Executive Director and General Counsel of the Commission. And our work here is to ensure that citizens are getting access to their government at its most basic level. So my real interest here is in the policy and transparency and notice issues that Senator Blumenthal spoke of. Particularly, we're also seeing a number of cases coming through the commission that deal with technology, and in this burgeoning realm, we want to make sure we get it right here at the commission, and we want to make sure that there is as much access and transparency and notice around government's use of this technology.
Thank you very much, Colleen. Next, Steve Hernandez, Executive Director for the Commission for Women, Children, Seniors, Equity, and Opportunity.
Thank you so much, James. Steve Hernandez, as you said, and as the title
suggests we focus on behalf of the legislature on issues related to equity and opportunity. In addition to the perils that we understand that these emerging technologies might represent, there's also an incredible amount of opportunity that will inure to the benefit of humanity in general, but the people of Connecticut more specifically. And we want to ensure that we have access to that opportunity across all of the traditional barriers, and that we, at the same time, are able to protect people. So thank you, James, for leading this important conversation, and I'm excited to work with all of you.
Steve, thank you very much. I am going to circle back with you afterwards in Susan's presentation from NCSL on using existing laws. That's one of the things we hear frequently. So discrimination is discrimination, whether it's from an algorithm or it originates from a person. So I would like to see, I don't know if you have a researcher, and we'll talk about trying to get a list of the discrimination laws that we have on the books and seeing if we do need to adjust any of them related to algorithmic discrimination or specific references to those laws. So, but thank you for your expertise and your willingness to always help out. It's much appreciated. So next, Lucio De Luca from the court.
Yes, thank you, Senator. My name is Lucio De Luca. I'm a 36-year veteran of the Connecticut Judicial Branch, and I have both a legal and technology background, and I'm currently the executive director of the IT division.
Thank you very much. And then Nick, I think, is my co-chair, Nick D'Onofrio.
Yeah, I'm still here. Maybe some of you wished I weren't. Yeah, so Senator has his view along with his co-chairs. I'm going to try to constantly stimulate you to think a little differently. That's all about this stuff. There is, as scary as this might be and as mystifying as it is, we're going to demystify it, and we're going to find ways to help people better understand what their responsibilities are and hold them responsible and accountable for it. So I'm excited to be with you, and thank you again, Jim, for having me along.
Oh, Nick, thank you very much. And we're counting on your viewpoint and to push us. And I think that that's the key. We get the best legislation when we work together and we incorporate a variety of viewpoints. I think what we'll do after this meeting, I do apologize, we went over significantly from what we had said. I do usually try to keep it close to the time, but if you could send me feedback if we should extend the time or I guess maybe cut out one speaker for future meetings. We won't need to do introductions going forward in the future meetings. But before we close, I just do want to echo what Nick said. And then part of our responsibility, I think, as leaders is to demystify the artificial intelligence and make it less scary for people. We know that change is scary. Going back to the late 1700s when they warned that reading novels would lead to people not being able to tell the difference between fiction and reality, and that now we wish people would read novels versus the internet. But again, anytime thing changes, technological unemployment was defined before the Great Depression as, the first in the Industrial Revolution, when they were afraid that all the automation would lead to mass unemployment. So there are similarities and things we've been through. This is probably a new revolution, but artificial intelligence, the term was coined in 1955 at Dartmouth College. So this as a technology is nothing new, but I think it's, as we see, it's the visibility of things. And that's also something that we've seen back when they invented anesthesia and they were also talking about the importance of antiseptic and being cleanly in surgeries. But they first adopted anesthesia because the doctors could see the pain of the patients. So they first took care of that thing that you could see versus focusing on changing their clothes and washing their hands, because the infections wouldn't show up till often weeks later, and the doctor himself wouldn't see that. So we know that now that this is being seen, it's more of a problem, but we also have to dig into not just the generative AI, but the algorithms and the algorithmic discrimination and other issues, but also not inadvertently hamper innovation, because that's what has made our state great and will continue to make our country great. So thank you to everyone. If you have feedback on the length of time for these meetings, number of speakers, or if you want to talk in between the meetings, we do have the next meeting set. We're still finalizing the speakers, but the next meeting will be October 25th from 11 to 1. Mark Raymond will be presenting, as well as perhaps Scott or Adele from OPM, talking about the state policies and procedures, giving us an update on where they are. Heather from NCSL will be giving us a state overview of the different state legislation. And then we're also have reached out to representatives from Washington State. They had published their policies and procedures governing state use of generative AI, and I thought it would be interesting to hear from someone there. And so if you, we may keep it to speakers.
They've confirmed that they will.
Oh,
be.
okay, great.
Yep.
So thanks to Bart for confirming that. So, and then depending on the feedback, we may just keep it to 3 speakers instead of asking for a 4th speaker for that meeting. But thank you everyone for your time and your help as we go through this process.
And your leadership, Senator. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Yep. Best to everyone. Cheers. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.